Fayaz's question, and that's a really good question. It says, don't you think what constitutes literature is entirely subjective? Yes and no, because you will have to tell me what your definition of subjectivity is. That's where the biggest debates are, right? Because subjective is not necessarily an individual subjectivity, right? Your subjectivity, if you go through Althusser, is already in an ideology. And if we acknowledge that, that means other people can share that ideology as well. So at any given time when you and me are making our individual pronouncements, we are corresponding to a certain ideology in which we live. And if we do that, if we share that, then my subjective opinion could very easily correspond to your subjective opinion, because the values that we bring to bear upon a work of literature are socially and ideologically constructed. So it is subjective, but it can be more than that, right? And how can it be more than that? I mean, let's start from that it is not natural. Literature, as Terry Eagleton would tell you, it doesn't hit you on the head and say, I am literature, acknowledge me. What we expect to be literary, what we expect to be good literature, obviously is something that is socially constructed, ideologically constructed. What we prefer to be something good in language, the rhythm of language, the similes, the metaphors, the stories we tell, all of that we assign a value to, obviously is not natural, right? It is something that we have internalized, that any good story must have, any good novel must have. So that gives us the first insight. The question of value is intimately connected to our social position and the subjectivity that social class or position creates. And if we buy into that, then we can extrapolate from that what we value in any literary text, or the value that we assign to it, may not necessarily just be inherent in the text itself, but that we bring it to the text. We bring our own value system to it and then judge it, right? So the value of literature then is contingent upon the reception of the reader, right? And that takes us to reception theory, right? Now, remember, we teach our students all these literary theories, right? At the core of all those literary theories, new criticism, structuralism, post-structuralism, new historicism, Marxism, is the question of value, right? What value do we assign to literature? How do we decide that value? What differentiates good literature from bad literature, right? So if you're a new critic, you will say that there are inherent constructions within a text that define whether it's a literary text or not. So you're privileging the text itself. If you are a reception theorist, you will say, well, there can be informed readings and there can be expert readings and there can be lay readings by people who are not trained, depending on who is opining upon a text, and their prestigious location as a reader will assign value to the text. So let's say you review a novel on your website and I review it in New York Times. Because of my positioning as a New York Times reviewer, my estimation of the novel might be considered more weighty and more privileged, right? The difference isn't because we haven't read it. The difference is that one person is in a larger discourse of knowledge production where he or she has the privilege of enunciating certain opinions. But if we go through all of that, what we are learning one thing, and that is that the value is assigned by either a consciousness outside of the text, within a given discourse of value, evaluating the text, or we have internalized certain ways of thinking about literature through our education, through our gender identity, through our class biases, right? And then that is what enables us to decide the value of the text. I mean, think of it this way. Pick up any novel that has these powerful male characters, right? And chances are, if you read it uncritically as a man, you're like, oh man, this is a heroic journey. I mean, Dastan of Amir Hamza, I just talked about it yesterday. It's a great epic from the Middle East. I read it as a man all my life, and I realized now when I read it, it's a masculinist text. There are no women of agency and power in it. Even if they are there, they are subservient to men. Now that is a feminist reading. I can incorporate that because I'm sympathetic to feminist causes. If I'm an uncritical man who is bought into the idea of naturalized gender hierarchies, I'll be perfectly fine with that novel. Now, if a woman reads that novel and she's conscious of how gender roles play, to her, Dastan of Amir Hamza is not going to be this epic story of, what she can love. She would basically say, hey, you know, this is just a male fantasy. All of those values that we are assigning to it are subjective, but subjective in a sense that at any given moment, we have a certain way of evaluating a text. Part of it is our training, part of it is what we have been taught to look for in a literary text, but part of it is also our subject position in the world. And there is no way of detaching that subject position from an act of reading. So these are my rough views. Now, those of you who have watched my lectures on Terry Eagleton's literary theory, you can already see I'm drawing so much on that. So that would then teach you that so much of what I think of literature is informed by a leftist progressive way of literary studies and a leftist way of looking at literature and assigning it value. The question of value then, in my opinion, is always contingent upon our class affiliations, our gender affiliations, the part of the world that we come from, and what we have internalized as good or bad literature, right? So let's go to Oroko's question. That's a really good question. So literature to me has always been a mode of escape to live other people's life and yet remain myself. Absolutely. So remember, that's what the Romantics believed in. So what your point of view is what the Romantics, critics, and poets believed in, that the world in which we live may be harsh, may not be what we want. So we use the work of literature to create this alternative, beautiful world. And as readers, then we can enter that world to escape whatever realities that at any given time we are not happy with, which we cannot alter. So in that sense, an engagement with literature becomes a sort of escape from reality. So the value of that literature then is connected to giving you solace, giving you a place to feel yourself or recuperate yourself. And so that value that you will assign to literature is dependent upon what you want it to be. And it's not something that literature naturally offers itself as. It can become that, right? So the value still is assigned by you because of your social and individual needs, right?